So the theoretical ambition in the book in the first place is just to think about the law of war in the way that modern American law professors think about law much more broadly. That is a system of let's say, carrots as well as sticks. The modern law of war, certainly modern IHL, law more broadly on the international scene with a humanitarian bent, is really mostly law of sticks and not of carrots. By contrast, the law in the 18th century, famous as a period of relatively civilized warfare, was really mostly a law of carrots, or at least that's what I try to demonstrate. First of all, so the incentives were incentives that only encouraged, didn't require, that encouraged combatants to resolve war within the limits of the battlefield. What were the rewards for resolving war within the limits of the battlefield in what was called open confrontation in the traditions of the law? Well, first of all, in a process supervised by diplomats, victors were entitled to claim the fruits of victory. The fruits of victory were ordinarily territory, to which the combatants, who were ordinarily sovereigns, had claims as a matter of the law of dynastic succession. The battle was understood as a legal procedure for resolving disputes over dynastic succession. That's why the wars of the 18th century go by the name, the War of the Succession, whatever it might be, of the Spanish succession or the Polish succession. As I say, victory in battle, at least potentially, translated into diplomatic victory. Now, that had to be determined by the diplomats, but there were real rewards offered to sovereigns who submitted to the verdict of battle, as I call it in the book. Sovereigns who submitted to the verdict of battle who could receive diplomatic recognition for the territorial claims that they were making. There were other incentives, too, that in some ways I think are of more interest for the modern world, although I don't pursue these particular claims in the conclusion of the book. There were other incentives in being recognized as a member of the community of civilized sovereigns. Now, that mattered a great deal, too, to somebody like Frederick the Great, for example, who's my main subject in the book. It mattered a great deal to be recognized as one of the clan, one of the brotherhood of sovereigns. And civilized sovereigns, in the understanding of the 18th century, were people who fought civilized wars. They often contrasted themselves in particular with Attila or Tamerlane or the hobgoblins of the law of war in Europe in the late Middle Ages and then in the early modern period. They didn't act like that. They made legal claims. They fought out their wars in civilized ways. And both of those kinds of incentives contributed to what was, I think, properly described as a relatively civilized practice of war in the 18th century. Let me emphasize, I'm not claiming what no sensible person would claim, that all war was pretty and pleasant. Of course it wasn't. The question really is, as always, what the alternative was, and compared to the alternatives, particularly the 17th century alternatives, or the late 19th, early 20th century alternatives, it was a pretty appealing way to fight. But certainly not. And I don't mean to claim in the book that the incentives would work in the same way. Now, although it's worth observing that some of the kinds of incentives that involved offering or guaranteeing sovereigns membership in the community of civilized sovereigns are used, not necessarily in the context of war. One thinks in particular of the dealings between the EU and Turkey. Turkey's been offered many incentives, carrots rather than sticks. The problem, of course, is that the process of integrating Turkey into the EU has been handled so clumsily, and there's been so much political resistance in Europe that it can't really be said that these sorts of incentives have worked in the way one might hope. But it's not that we've forgotten that those kinds of incentives might be offered. It's difficult to offer those kinds of incentives, of course, in a world in which we're committed to the proposition that legitimate sovereigns must be organized as democracies. It's very difficult to get an autocrat to cooperate with you when it's very difficult to treat the offer of membership in the community as an incentive when what you're asking the autocrat to do is give up and submit to democratic processes. And to that extent, it's impossible, really, to do the kinds of things that were done in the 19th century, unless we're willing to take what is for us a very dramatic step and accept the legitimacy of monarchy. Now, I think we could, I haven't done it in the book, you could push the argument in that direction. You could make the observation, for example, that in the wake of the Arab Spring, that the Arab countries that are most stable and doing best are monarchies, as Morocco and Jordan. You could make a case for monarchy if you wanted to do that, but I'm not going to try to do that. I do think you'd have to make that case if you wanted to offer those particular kinds of incentives to sovereigns in the modern world. Most of the book, though, is not about reviving the practices of the 18th century. I don't think we're going to succeed in reviving the practices of the 18th century. My focus is on something narrower, but something that I think is of obvious importance to Americans in the wake of the Iraq War. Not really the law of war in the largest sense, but the law of victory. That is the question of how you end the wars once you get into them. And it's really there that I most want to suggest in the book that understanding that the war can offer, that the result of a war can be material gains, can offer us means of extracting ourselves from wars that are very attractive. That is, no matter what the reason for entering into, no matter what the jus ad bellum justification, in the technical term, for entering into the war in the first place, in the end, maybe we can extract ourselves from the conflict by giving some kind of material advantage to both sides at the end, just by negotiating. And negotiations, unfortunately, have to be, in the end, about material interests. What else can you negotiate about? Human rights are non-negotiable. It's a great question, I have to say. So I at least think of battle tourists as a mid-19th century phenomenon. And of course, in their mid-19th century form, they are a mid-19th century phenomenon. Nobody goes out with picnic baskets to watch battles any longer. But they did this all the time in the 1850s and 1860s. As I mentioned, the book Henri Dunant, whose memoir, The Battle of Solferino, is triggered modern humanitarian, the founding of the Red Cross and modern humanitarian movements, went as a battle tourist. You gotta read the book, guys. He starts out by describing the battle in all of its glory and the plumes on the helmets of the emperors, all the rest of this stuff. Nobody would be foolish enough to do that kind of battle tourism any longer. So, certainly by the time World War I came along, it was obvious to everybody that it would be extremely foolish to go out with a picnic basket and watch the battle. On the other hand, I, being older than you, remember, for example, the first Gulf War, we watched the thing on TV. We did watch the thing on TV, and we even ate lunch as we watched the thing on TV. You know, so there is an element of battle tourism that's undoubtedly there. There is one other element, though, in 19th century battle tourism that has to be mentioned, which may or may not still be present. One of the reasons that battle tourism was so popular in the mid-19th century was that people were convinced of something in the mid-19th century that they may or may not still be convinced of. They were convinced that what happened in battles is that battles embodied the verdict of history. Now, this is, from my point of view, part of the reason that the old, more sane ways of doing war died out. That is, people got the idea that a battle was not just a way of resolving a dispute, but a moment at which the hand of God reached down and decided that, as most famously the Battle of Marathon, that Western civilization would survive, or something like that. I'm not sure how much we still think of things in those ways. Now, I mean, we certainly think of World War II that way. That is, we understand, we in the West understood World War II as a victory for liberal democracy. The Soviets understood it as a victory for communism. None of the victors were prepared to think of it as a somewhat fortuitous accidental resolution of a dispute. In the 18th century, everybody understood that there was a great element of fortuity in the result of these things. Whether we're still prepared after this experience of Afghanistan and Iraq to imagine that wars are events in which great historical conflicts are fought out, whether, correspondingly, we want to be tourists who witness history in the making in quite the same way they did in the mid-19th century, I'm not sure.